Hey guys, Mr. P.
What's up, guys? It's Mr. Schmitz.
And in this video, we're going to talk about chemical energy and ATP. So right off the bat, what is ATP?
ATP is the cell's energy molecule. It stands for adenosine triphosphate. So just from the name adenosine triphosphate, you can get some clues about what its actual structure is.
Yep, tri means 3, and phosphate obviously means phosphate. And so these PO4 molecules, so if we circle PO4, 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 these would be the phosphates. And we have 3 of them. And then we have an adenosine. So the adenosine, which is this part of the molecule, is composed of a pentose. It's a 5-carbon sugar. We've done some biochemistry in this class. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 carbons. This is the ribose, and this is an adenine. And then together, collectively, the ribose and adenine make adenosine.
And so what type of biological molecule would this fall under then?
So ATP is a nucleic acid. And so if you remember back from our biochemistry unit, we had carbohydrates, lipids, nucleic acids, and proteins. This type of molecule with its nitrogenous base or nitrogen-containing component would belong to the nucleic acid class of molecules.
And so we mentioned that ATP is our energy molecule. And if you notice, labeled on our diagram here is a bond, and it's highlighted there, and you can see there's actually multiple bonds. Each of those 3 phosphates are bonded together, and it is in the bond where that energy is actually being held.
Yeah, notice this little, what looks like energy poof, right? This is a high energy bond. It's a covalent bond, so it's a strong bond. And in the next slide, we're going to get into kind of the cycling between ADP and ATP, but this, just so that we kind of have our bearing straight, is where all of the energy, or most of the energy, that is going to be usable for the cell when utilizing this molecule is going to be stored. So high energy bond between the phosphates, specifically between the 3rd and 2nd. If we say this is the 3rd and this is the 2nd phosphate, the high energy bond is right between the 2nd and 3rd.
Well, where would the first phosphate be, Mr. Pfeiffer?
I thought that was self-explanatory. Number 1 is here.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah. So looking at the ATP and ADP cycle, you can see that we have this ATP molecule. So this is the same molecule. We're just kind of zooming out and looking at how it interacts with other substances in the cell. ATP is adenosine triphosphate. We have the adenine, we have the ribose, which is that 5-carbon sugar, and then we have the triphosphate. So this is the ATP molecule. But there is another molecule called ADP, and what does that stand for?
That would be adenosine diphosphate, the prefix di meaning 2. We've used that prefix several times throughout the year already, so hopefully by now you know that the prefix di means 2. But if not, adenosine diphosphate would refer to the version of the molecule that only possesses 2 phosphates.
And we also just said that if the energy is stored between the 2nd and 3rd bond by removing this 3rd phosphate, and this is the number 3 phosphate, which was on the end of our ATP, by removing that phosphate, we release the energy that's stored in that bond, and that's what the energy is used for, or that's how the energy is released, and so the cell can utilize that energy for a variety of biological processes.
So that energy is released through a process we call hydrolysis, which you have, again, heard of previously when we talked a lot about molecule formation and deconstruction in our biomolecules unit. Hydrolysis means to use water to split apart the molecule.
Yeah, so remember we had an H2O molecule, we split it into an H plus and an OH minus, and so by giving the H and the OH to the different parts of the molecule, one going obviously to the ADP and one going to the phosphate, making it a full outer energy level, making it stable as a standalone molecule, the phosphate can be released, and we can release the energy that's stored within that molecule. All that energy is therefore going to be utilized within the cell for a variety of biological processes. So by hydrolyzing our ATP, we are now in an ADP state. This is a low energy state, whereas ATP was a high energy state. And so what do we do with a battery that is depleted?
Well, we try to find a way to recharge it. We plug our phone in.
Right. So, and I guess I should bring this up. We typically talk about this ATP-ADP cycle in the context of a battery. most batteries, or all batteries for that matter, are rechargeable. I don't know that anybody that buys a battery for like a single time usage. I guess unless we're talking about AA's and AAA's, we throw those away.
Those can be recharged
those
sometimes
can
too.
also be recharged, but for the purposes of like our cell phones, computers, those have rechargeable batteries. Obviously, those are a lot more efficient than just batteries we throw away. But this molecule is a battery. It stores energy. It releases energy for chemical work, for cellular work, and we want to recharge it. So how do we recharge ADP?
So when we get to that low energy molecule ADP, we are able to phosphorylize through the process of phosphorylation by adding that third phosphate back on. So we're able to take a free-floating phosphate or remove a phosphate from another molecule, depending on the process, and attach it back to the end of that ADP molecule, therefore reforming ATP or recharging that battery to make that high energy molecule.
When we stick that third phosphate onto ADP, it stores the high energy bond, or stores the energy within that high energy covalent bond, and then stores it until we again hydrolyze it, pull that phosphate off, and release it for cellular work. Like you said, these phosphates are kind of free floating in the cytoplasm, or they can be attached to other molecules, those other molecules typically coming from food. And when we get into cellular respiration, next unit, utilizing the mitochondria, which I still hear in class people calling the powerhouse of the cell. Need to get away from that. This energy from food, typically we're talking glucose, right? So the cell is going to break down glucose, or the mitochondria is going to break down glucose, and part of that breakdown in this glycolysis process is the removal of phosphate. Where does that phosphate go?
It's going to attach to the end of ADP to form ATP. The other really cool part about that process is that it actually produces water as a byproduct, which can then be used later on to break apart the molecule through hydrolysis.
Yeah, pretty neat.
So just to talk about how ATP is used a little bit further, we've got a couple of examples here. The one on the left is something you should be very familiar with. This is the sodium-potassium pump, which is a form of active transport. We talked about active transport and the sodium-potassium pump last unit. By looking at the sodium-potassium pump, you can actually see exactly how ATP is being used. We defined active transport as the use of energy to move molecules across the membrane.
And it's important, not to interrupt, but ATP is utilized because we're moving these molecules from low to high concentration.
Yeah, so we are moving them from low to the high concentration, which requires energy because we're moving up against the gradient. So if you look in this diagram, you've got your pump in the membrane. And as that pump gets filled with sodium to move out of the cell, it requires an ATP molecule to release that phosphate and release that energy. And you can actually see that the phosphate is being used to attach to the protein and change the shape of the protein, because we know proteins are very intricately folded molecules. So this phosphate changes the shape of the protein, therefore opening it to the other side of the cell, which is what allows that sodium to then leave the cell, which is where it can then be filled with potassium. And then once it is filled with potassium, it can change its shape back by releasing that phosphate and therefore allowing the potassium into the cell.
Yep, so both potassium and sodium are being actively pumped against their concentration gradient, utilizing the energy in ATP.
Right, it's only done because ATP's energy is being used in that moment. What's our other example?
So this second example is called muscle contraction. This is basically two different fibers, and we're not going to require you to know the intricacies of the sliding filament theory. However, we wanted to kind of highlight ATP's role within a process that should be fairly familiar to you. Muscles contract, that's what allows you to move. It's a phenomenal process that allows you to play sports and to just navigate your world. But there are two filaments. You have an actin filament, which is the green, and you have a thick myosin filament, which is this kind of thicker purple one. And you have these cross bridges, which again, you don't necessarily need to know about, but you'll notice a ADP and phosphate. The little PI just means inorganic phosphate. It's not a big deal. ADP and phosphate. And then you'll notice down here an ATP. So we're still utilizing ATP, but ADP and phosphate are bound to these cross bridges, which allow them to basically stick the two filaments together so that they don't readily slide past each other. That kind of just locks them in place. Once they pop off, Then the myosin head releases itself, and so ATP is going to then kind of reattach it, which basically causes it to change position and allows the two filaments to slide, which means the muscle can get shorter, which makes it contract. So you are actually able to move as an organism because your muscle fibers are getting shorter and longer based on the interaction of ATP conversion to ADP.
So basically, every single time you make a movement and your muscle shortens, you have been burning ATP.
Yep. All day long. Your muscle is contracting. And think, some of your muscles are heart muscles, which are indefatigable, which again, we don't need to necessarily know about. But your muscle contraction, even in hearts and peristalsis with the esophagus and stomach and the small intestine, like all of that requires a constant burning of ATP.
Yeah, so you've got muscles that you don't even think about that are always contracting and moving.
Yeah. And then not to mention, the muscles that everybody likes, like the biceps. Right, you want to show off the guns, you got to do a little muscle contraction, and so you're burning ATP every time.
Sorry, I was flexing in the background. I got to get in the gym.
Right. Yeah, and you need to bump up your ATP production. Right? ATP production leads to higher concentrations of ATP, which leads to more ATP burning, which leads to more muscle contraction.
Right.
And
higher
so on.
output of your muscles.
Right.
Well, that's all we've got for you guys today. Thank you so much for sticking around and talking about ATP.
Yep, we will review all of the ATP stuff in class, but for now, see ya.